In the late summer of 55 BC, despite the lateness of the campaigning season, Caesar made the strategic decision to embark on an expedition to Britain. He assembled a fleet of 80 transport ships, sufficient to carry 2 legions, specifically Legio VII and Legio X, along with an unspecified number of warships led by a quaestor. The fleet set sail from a port in the territory of the Morini, likely identified as Portus Aetius. Additionally, 18 transports carrying cavalry were launched from a different port, possibly Amblitus. The composition of these ships is uncertain. They might have been triremes or biremes, vessels influenced by Venetic designs observed by Caesar earlier, or even ships requisitioned from the Veneti and other coastal tribes. As dawn broke over the English Channel, an unsettling quiet pervaded the fleet. The 80 transport ships, accompanied by a dozen warships, sailed in close formation, their crews anxiously scanning the horizon. Tension gripped all on board as they strained to catch their first glimpse of the foreign land ahead. Gradually, the white cliffs of Dover emerged, glowing brightly in the morning light, signaling the approach to Britain. On land, the Britons, initially caught off guard, quickly observed the Roman fleet's progress. Once they grasped the Romans' intentions, their war chiefs responded by sending cavalry and chariots racing ahead to intercept the invaders. The chosen landing site was a long, flat beach situated between the present-day locations of Walmer Castle and Deal. The Britons arrived first, positioning themselves to defend their territory. As the leading ships of the Roman fleet approached the shore, the Briton cavalry and chariots charged along the sands, their warriors brandishing javelins and issuing challenges to the approaching invaders. Some of the Britons dismounted and waded into the shallow waters, shaking their javelins and large rectangular shields while hurling insults at the Romans. The nobility among them were more richly attired and better equipped, while the common warriors were typically smaller in stature, with mustaches but no beards. They were stripped to the waist, their faces and torsos adorned with intricate blue woad designs, displaying a fierce and defiant appearance. Caesar commanded the landing to commence, and the transport ships maneuvered into the shallow waters before grounding on the beach. He also signaled the escorting warships to run aground further down the coast, targeting the Britons' right flank. This strategic position allowed the warships to provide cover for the landing with their artillery and the auxiliary archers stationed on several cruisers. The commanders of the warships promptly complied, guiding their vessels toward the shore. As their oars cut through the surf, they unleashed volleys of arrows to support the Roman troops as they disembarked. On the shore, the Britons, who had never before encountered ships propelled by banks of oars, began to lose their initial confidence and retreated out of range. Recognizing this as the opportune moment he had been anticipating, Caesar ordered the legionaries of the 7th and 10th legions to disembark. However, despite the command, the troops hesitated, apprehensive about the deep water surrounding them and the powerful surf that threatened to knock them off their feet. At this critical moment, the Aquilifer of the 10th Legion, the bearer of its eagle standard, took a decisive action that would immortalize him, although his name has not survived in the historical record. Likely no more than 27 years old, he may have first recited the legionaries' prayer. Jupiter, greatest and best, protect this legion, soldiers all. According to Caesar, he then added, "May my act bring good luck to us all." With these words, he went over the side of the ship, carrying the eagle of the 10th Legion into the water, leading the way for his comrades. "Jump in, boys," he called to his comrades, raising the standard high. "Unless you want to surrender our eagle to the enemy, I, for one, intend to do my duty to my homeland and my general." The men of the 10th, stationed on ships around him, watched in dismay as the Aquilifer carried their silver eagle toward the shore. The eagle, later to become gold in imperial times, was deeply revered by the legionaries. It was kept on an altar in the camp with lamps burning through the night, and both the eagle and the ground it stood on were considered sacred. While the men of the first cohort were responsible for transporting and safeguarding the eagle, every soldier in the legion was obligated to defend it with their life. Roman generals were celebrated as national heroes for reclaiming eagles captured by the enemy from legions, but the loss of an eagle was never forgotten. It was the gravest dishonor a legion could endure to have its eagle captured in battle, leaving an indelible stain on the reputation of the legion and its soldiers. The soldiers of the 10th Legion were well aware of the numerous instances in Roman history where eagle bearers, legionaries, and centurions had sacrificed their lives to protect the eagle standard. The sight of their eagle bearer seemingly about to surrender the eagle of the 10th to the Britons infuriated them. With a shout of indignation, the men of the 10th descended from their ships and waded through the surf, determined to follow their fearless eagle bearer and defend their sacred standard against the approaching Britons. Not wanting to be overshadowed, the men of the 7th Legion also disembarked upon witnessing the 10th Legion's resolute advance, and they too moved toward the shore to join the fray.
This is a good day to live and make sure they die.
The legionaries managed to reach the beach with relative ease. However, the disembarkation process, which involved small groups exiting the boats in extended, narrow lines, made them vulnerable to attacks from the British cavalry. The Britons exploited this vulnerability by targeting the exposed right sides of the Roman troops with their missiles. As the legionaries struggled to fend off the British attackers, many lost sight of their individual standards. Training had taught them that in the absence of their own unit's standard during battle, any standard could be used as a point of reference in an emergency. Nonetheless, this approach led to confusion rather than order, as soldiers clustered together in some areas while leaving gaps elsewhere, further complicating their efforts to maintain a cohesive defense. Recognizing the danger that the men disembarking from each transport could become isolated and vulnerable to being overwhelmed, Caesar swiftly ordered the small boats from each larger vessel to be lowered. These boats were filled with additional troops, who were then deployed as rapid response squads to reinforce legionaries in distress. This tactic proved effective, as the reinforced maniples and cohorts were able to regroup around their own standards, enabling them to counterattack and push the Britons back. As the native forces began to retreat, Caesar lamented the absence of his cavalry. In typical Roman battle strategy, the cavalry would capitalize on the infantry's success by pursuing the fleeing enemy over long distances. However, lacking this crucial force, Caesar's legionaries were recalled after advancing only half a mile to ensure they maintained contact with their commanders on the beach. Despite the initial resistance, the success of the Roman landing had a significant impact on the local tribes. As the Roman forces began to establish their position just inland from the beach, British envoys approached Caesar, bringing with them the captive Atrebates King Commius, Caesar's ambassador, and his 30-man cavalry escort, along with their horses. All the prisoners were returned unharmed, and Caesar welcomed the young king of the Atrebates warmly. In response to the Roman success, the British envoys requested peace. Caesar, in turn, demanded hostages as a condition for negotiations. Some hostages were delivered immediately, while others from various tribes began to travel to Caesar to fulfill this requirement. 4 days after Caesar's landing in Kent, Favorable south winds finally enabled the cavalry to set sail from Amblitus to join their commander. However, as the 18 transports carrying the cavalry and their horses neared the Deal area, where the Roman troops had established their beachhead, a violent storm suddenly descended from the north. The tempests scattered the transports, forcing some back to the coast of France, while others were driven down the English coast and had to remain at sea overnight before eventually returning to their starting point at Amblitus the following day. Although no ships were lost in the storm, none of them succeeded in reaching Caesar. The ships of the first convoy experienced even greater misfortune during the storm. The warships remained beached on the sand where they had landed on the first day, while the transport vessels were anchored just off the shore. That night, under the light of a full moon, a high tide occurred. The Romans, unfamiliar with the phenomenon of particularly high tides coinciding with full moons on the Atlantic coast, had not taken any precautions. As a result, the unusually high tide inundated the warships. Simultaneously, the storm drove the anchored transports onto the shore. Some of these vessels were wrecked along the coast, while the others suffered significant damage. By morning, none of the ships were in a condition to be used. Suddenly, Caesar found himself isolated, lacking both long-term supplies and the means to transport them from France, as well as the ability to return quickly to France for the winter as he had originally planned. Sensing an opportunity, the British chieftains, who had been advocating for peace and cooperation just days earlier, conspired to renew hostilities against the comparatively small Roman force. As Caesar would later discover, their strategy involved starving the legionaries into submission, hoping that this tactic would deter any future Roman incursions into Britain. While the men of the 10th Legion focused on salvaging the wrecked ships, Caesar dispatched the 7th Legion into the surrounding fields, which were ripe with British wheat. The initial day of harvesting had been successful, with the legionaries returning to the beachhead camp carrying numerous sacks of grain. The following morning, after dawn, the 7th Legion marched back into the fields. It was a pleasant, sunny, late summer morning as they advanced, passing small groups of Britons on their way to the camp, likely to conduct business with the Roman supply officers stationed at the beach. In the distance, British men, women, and children could be seen working in the fields, tilling the soil, and tending to their cattle. For the Spanish legionaries, this peaceful rural scene might have evoked memories of their homeland. A few miles from the camp and out of sight of it, the 7th Legion reached the area where they had been working the previous day, a wheat field extending towards distant woods. 2/3 of the field had already been harvested, leaving only a section near the woods still to be reaped. Upon arrival, the legionaries planted their standards in the ground, set down their javelins, and leaned their shields against them. They then removed their helmets and, equipped with scythes, wicker baskets, and empty sacks, began to spread out among the rows of wheat. As they cut and collected the grain, they chatted and laughed among themselves, although their optios and centurions closely supervised the work, occasionally reminding them to remain focused if their conversations became too lively. The legionaries had been at work for only a few minutes when, without warning, javelins began striking the ground around the soldiers nearest the woods. Moments later, with terrifying war cries, thousands of Britons surged out from the trees, weapons in hand, intent on spilling Roman blood. The legionaries closest to the woods were cut down before they even realized what was happening. As centurions shouted orders, the men of the 7th Legion scrambled for their weapons. There was no time for trumpet signals or for forming up by squad, century, maniple, or cohort. The Roman troops hastily assembled into a rough, disorganized battle line, standing shoulder to shoulder with unfamiliar comrades. In that moment, each soldier keenly felt how much he had come to rely on the habits and camaraderie of his own unit. The Britons had concealed themselves in the woods throughout the night, anticipating that the legionaries would return in the morning to harvest the remaining wheat. As the Roman soldiers worked, the Briton infantry emerged, swiftly encircling the men of the 7th Legion, closing in on them like the jaws of a vice. Meanwhile, the tribal chieftains signaled to their cavalry and chariots, which had been positioned at a distance. The chariots surged forward, becoming mobile weapon platforms that raced back and forth along the Roman line. The nobles, standing beside the drivers, hurled javelins with each pass, making the vehicles difficult targets. The thunderous noise of pounding hooves and rumbling wheels filled the air, overwhelming the legionaries, who quickly lost track of the number of chariots. There seemed to be hundreds, perhaps even thousands. Indeed, Caesar would later record that the Britons fielded as many as 4,000 chariots against him the following year. The spectacle of the charioteers, some of whom would daringly run out onto the chariot pole as far as the yoke while the chariots raced at full speed, was a display of skill intended to awe the Roman soldiers. The men of the 7th, despite their decade of service in the Roman army, had never encountered anything like it. The British cavalry charged forward in groups, threw their javelins, and then maneuvered to allow the chariots to pass through the gaps between the cavalry squadrons in a coordinated move. To the legionaries, this tactic might have seemed almost elegant if they were not in the midst of a desperate battle. A new tactic soon emerged. The chariots would wheel around and stop, allowing the nobles to dismount and attack the Roman line with their swords, targeting the legionaries' shields. If the Romans moved to engage them, the nobles would retreat to the chariots, which would then quickly leave, causing the Roman line to become disjointed. This forced the legionaries to retreat rapidly to avoid being exposed to other chariots waiting nearby for just such an opportunity. The Britons displayed a confident air, having surrounded the Romans on unfamiliar terrain and cutting them off from any reinforcements. None of the Roman soldiers had escaped to call for help, and the highly regarded legionaries appeared disorganized and intimidated. To the tribesmen, the complete destruction of the 7th Legion likely seemed imminent. In the Roman camp, the legionaries on tower duty observed a large dust cloud, clearly the result of human activity. They quickly reported this to Caesar, noting that the 7th Legion was in that direction. Caesar, already aware of the direction the 7th Legion had taken for their foraging mission that morning, deduced that the dust was likely caused by the movement of horses and chariots. Turning to the tribune of the watch, Caesar issued a series of urgent commands. The 2 guard cohorts were to immediately march with him to investigate the situation. 2 off-duty cohorts were to replace them on guard duty, while all remaining cohorts of the 10th Legion were to be mobilized and sent to support him. By the time Caesar's servants had equipped him with armor and gear, the 2 guard cohorts had assembled in formation behind their standards in the main street. The rest of the camp was in a state of activity, with soldiers rushing to respond to the 2 arms calls being sounded throughout the camp. Caesar led the march, accompanied by his personal standard bearer, deputies, and staff officers, all of whom were on foot. Caesar's own horse had been sent to Ambltus, with the ships that had been adapted for transporting horses, leaving the Roman camp without any horses. Even the 30 horsemen of King Commius's escort were out searching for fodder. At Caesar's command, the trumpets of the 2 guard cohorts sounded double time, urging the men of the 10th Legion to hasten towards the ominous dust cloud in the distance. As they approached, they were met with the thunderous noise of horses' hooves, the rumble of chariot wheels, and the shouting and yelling of the attacking tribesmen. The fields, which had earlier been occupied by the tribespeople going about their daily tasks, were now deserted. When Caesar and the men of the 10th Legion arrived, they found the 7th Legion holding its position. However, the ranks were closely packed and under heavy missile fire from the surrounding Britons. Upon seeing the approach of Roman reinforcements, the tribesmen's assault began to weaken. The tribesmen to the east, concerned about a potential attack from behind, withdrew, which allowed Caesar to join forces with the 7th Legion. With Caesar's reinforcements, the 7th Legion was able to reorganize behind their proper standards and spread out their ranks. The soldiers, now reunited with their own squads, likely took the opportunity to jest and reconnect with familiar comrades, relieved to be among friends again. They awaited further instructions from their centurions, who, despite being stern, were well known to them. Soon, 6 additional cohorts of the 10th Legion appeared over the horizon. As the 2 legions established an extended battle line, Caesar maintained his position while the Britons withdrew. Once the immediate threat had passed, Caesar led the legions back to the beachhead. The men of the 7th Legion, relieved to return to the safety of their camp, took the opportunity to refresh themselves and tend to their wounds. Despite their relief, Caesar was dissatisfied with the 7th Legion. They had not demonstrated the fighting prowess he had come to expect from one of his elite units. Following several days of relentless rain, which kept the legionaries confined to their tents, the soldiers remained on high alert, keeping their weapons close at hand in anticipation of further encounters with the Britons. Their expectations were soon met. During this period, tribes from southeastern England sent messengers across the region, boasting of the small size of the Roman force, suggesting that defeating the invaders would be easy, and highlighting the opportunity for plunder. As a result, once the weather improved, a large force of British infantry and cavalry began to gather around Caesar's camp. Roman lookouts provided ample warning of the approaching threat, allowing the legions sufficient time to don their decorations and helmet crests before marching out to form battle lines in front of their camp. The British infantry launched an immediate assault on the Roman front line, but were quickly driven back. The legions then advanced steadily, pushing the Britons away from their position. Caesar now had a small cavalry unit at his disposal, the squadron of 30 Atrebate horsemen who had accompanied King Commius. He dispatched them to pursue the retreating tribesmen. These mounted troops not only chased the Britons for several miles, but also set fire to the numerous Gallic-style timber and thatch farmhouses scattered throughout eastern Kent. After completing their mission, they returned to the Roman camp. Once again, the Britons sent envoys seeking peace. This time, Caesar demanded twice as many hostages as before to be sent to him on the continent. His naval officers reported that they had repaired all but 12 of the transports damaged in the recent storm, and all of the warships had been bailed dry. With this capacity, Caesar could manage to transport his entire force back to France. As the equinox approached, bringing with it the notoriously stormy weather from the north, Caesar prepared to leave. Within days, the army re-embarked and set sail back to Boulogne. The crossing was largely uneventful except for the final stages. A strong northern wind separated two of the transports from the main convoy, pushing them further along the French coast. The 300 legionaries on these transports, who were from either the 10th or 7th Legion, were able to land without difficulty. However, once ashore, they were attacked by French warriors from the renegade Morini tribe, who viewed them as vulnerable targets. Despite being surrounded, the legionaries maintained their position and managed to send a messenger to Caesar up the coast. Caesar promptly dispatched his idle cavalry from Ambleteuse and followed with the remaining troops from the 7th and 10th legions. The besieged legionaries held out for 4 hours until relief arrived, sustaining only a few injuries and no fatalities. Once the Roman cavalry appeared, the Morini warriors dispersed. Thus ended the first invasion of Britain. The men of the 10th Legion settled into winter quarters at Boulogne, anticipating that further action awaited them across the Channel. When they learned that only 2 out of the numerous British tribes that had pledged to send hostages to Caesar had fulfilled their promise, the men of the 10th understood where their next campaign would likely lead.